Hey, Lindsay.
Hi, how are you, Jason?
I'm good. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Can you tell the listeners and viewers who you are and where you're located?
Sure, I am Lindsay Baker. I am the Executive Director of Maryland Humanities, and I am personally located in Laurel, Maryland, working from the corner of my bedroom.
With a nice plant there to help with the
Yes,
oxygen. How
exactly.
long have you been there?
I started with Maryland Humanities in August, so 3, 4 months into the pandemic, and I've been working from home mostly, but going into the office a couple times a month. And the offices are in Baltimore.
Wow. Before we back up and talk a little bit about your career, what was that like starting with a new organization in the pandemic and trying to meet people and get your bearings, all that kind of stuff?
Right? Yeah, that could be a whole separate podcast, I'm sure. But for example, I've still never met any of my board members in person. Uh,
Wow.
I have met my staff in person. We did two staff outings outside. And so it's been difficult. I think anybody starting a new job finds that like building those relationships and getting to know your coworkers and your staff is really important. So I've tried to be really intentional about that, but I mean, there are definitely challenges since we're not together.
Yeah, I was one of the many people that quit during the pandemic. You're the one one that started, but of course you were working before. Going back, have you always, even college or before college, or did you have a passion for the humanities, history, art? Where did it begin?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I had been working in small museums, as you know, for many years. I started interning in museums my freshman year of college. I was majoring in history, but I knew I didn't want to be a teacher. I come from a family of people who work in education, and I think being a teacher is really difficult. I thought that this path would be easier. I'm not sure it is, but I I started working in small museums really from my freshman year. I interned for Claudia Leister at Delaware State Museums. That was my first internship.
Wow.
I attended SMA before the Small Museum Association, for people who don't know. I think we were in the same class of scholarship winners for SMA, and I was 20. So I attended the banquet unable to drink and saw what was happening in Ocean City at 20 years old. And I stuck around. So I feel like that's admirable. So I don't think I ever intentionally said I love the humanities. Like, I don't know, I would have known what the humanities were. But I really loved small museum work, and in being an executive director of a small museum for almost 10 years, I got to know Maryland Humanities in that context, and I really admired the work that they did, and partnered with them, and was a grantee in a number of ways. So I was very grateful to have this position.
What was your first kind of gig that really established you and kind of just propelled you forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think a bunch of unpaid internships, which I think is wrong, were helpful, but I don't think that that is the right thing for the field. I am not one of those people that thinks I went through it, you should too.
Right.
But I think the unpaid internships and some paid were what allowed me to become executive director of Laurel Historical Society. And I became the ED there fresh out of grad school with no other full-time, permanent work. But it was because I had done internships in so many different pieces of small museum work that I was able to take that position. And I think becoming the ED there, I think that is what propelled me and allowed me to continue to move up and to eventually now become the ED for Maryland Humanities. It was a really unique experience, and I stayed almost 10 years because over the years the position grew, as it does when you stay somewhere a long time, and the work changed, and I found myself very able to balance my normal work with work in the field. So being involved with SMA, being involved with AAM, being involved with AASLH, which I feel like all of that is really what created the ability to move on and move forward.
Was there anything at the your time at the Laurel Historical Society that any lessons learned there, just experience there that it has helped you in your current role?
Yeah, I
A
mean, I
lot of
think
stuff in there.
a lot, right? So much. But I would say the one thing that we struggle with as a field, with so many people with history degrees and museum study degrees and museum education degrees, is none of us get like MBAs. Like, I think I know of one colleague who I think you said you'd be interviewing soon, who went back and got her MBA. But I don't know people who come with that financial experience. And so I actually had a very good working relationship with our board treasurer, who did way too much and should not have been doing everything he was doing, but we worked through it. And eventually I started taking on more and more of the financial role with that organization. And I think that my willingness to take on things that I didn't know how to do and to learn them as I went. I think that's a small museum trait. Like, I mean, that's just what our work is. But I think being able to talk financials and becoming increasingly literate about financial issues within a 501c3 is was the most helpful in moving me forward.
Did you have obviously you had a lot of successes there. Any fundraising successes that you were particularly proud of while you're at Laurel?
Yeah. In the almost 10 years that I was there, I raised over half a million in their endowment. We didn't actually call it an endowment.
Okay.
Um, but I think as I'm better understanding finances, if I were to go back and do it, we did a lot of work raising funds around special events and around annual things that we did each year, as well as planned giving, which I think it was at I know it was at Bel Air, where Karen Daly, I do not remember what it was, if it was an MMA or SMA talk, but she came and she talked about planned giving. And
Hmm.
I left that, and she basically was like, we make it too hard. Just tell people to consider you for planned giving, and they will work with their estate lawyers to make it happen. And
Hmm.
I thought, oh my God, we've been worrying about this so much. And we've been trying to figure out, how do we create the pamphlet? What wording should they put in? And so I went back with that message from that professional development, and we started just putting it in all of our material. And we got two major planned gifts while I was there.
Hmm.
And they significantly increased, as I said, almost half a million in what we should have called our endowment, but we didn't. But I got a little sidetracked thinking about how my professional development led to that.
No, it's all
But
right.
I think the lesson that I've learned looking back is, we were a very small organization. We had one full-time person, and that was me, right? And there was a need for growth. There was a need. I mean, not everyone has to be big, but we needed at least like an education person, or to pay our docents, because our docents were volunteer, and a lot of aging out and timing issues. And that money that was put in our savings was considered sacred, but our budget had like 100,000 a year. So thinking
Hmm.
back on it, I think that I encouraged us to grow that savings when we really could have used it in a different way, to grow the organization, to grow the services that we provided. So that, I think that's an important lesson. And it's hard to put your finger on it when you're a new ED, like really figuring out the finances as you go.
Yeah, I mean, you're, at least for me, being so caught up in just trying to make sure that there's savings there, that there's enough funds um, to keep the place going. And but sometimes it's okay, and it's strategic to take some of those funds and invest in something that's going to help you grow. It's hard to do that though. It's
It's hard to do that with the nonprofit scarcity mindset, right?
yeah.
And when I do the math now, I realize we had over 8 years of budget money in our savings.
Hmm.
We could have hired somebody to do some of the things that I thought about, but I didn't have that capacity to understand. I think there's a lot more in the field now thinking about the nonprofit scarcity mindset that has really shifted my ability to think through those issues. So, I mean, it's just another way. I think that the only way to be successful in this field is to just keep growing and learning. And so I always think back, well, how would I have done that differently?
I wonder if, and I have no proof of this, but I wonder if our generation was facing sort of the pendulum was swinging in the direction of, we had heard about so many organizations that just, when someone got tired or fired, someone got hired, and they overextended themselves with their staffing. I mean, sort of over the past 20 years, that's what I always heard that from sort of the old timers of, we had too many staff, we had to let people go. And I'm just curious if some of us, you know, that got, at least in my mind, got lodged in my head that, oh, don't hire people, that kind of a thing. But I guess it depends on the organization and, case by case. But you do hear about that too, where it goes the other direction, where there's just too much hiring. It's not strategic in nature. And then the organization's overextended. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a little bit of context is I officially became ED and a full-time, museum professional in 2008. So, we were headed into a major economic recession. Most of the people who graduated grad school with me really struggled to find jobs.
Hmm.
And I think that idea that you don't know what the next big financial problem will be was always lodged in the back of my head. And I mean, now we're in COVID land, and so I'm faced with similar decisions at Maryland Humanities of like, there's definitely parts in which I think we have potential for growth with our staffing, but how do I think through the long-term impact? And I think that idea of, and I'm just kind of verbalizing this maybe for the first time, I think the idea that if you hire someone, you should be able to guarantee their funding indefinitely and their position indefinitely is a difficult one. And I think it, in some ways, prevents us from growing. But that's just coming to me as we talk through this.
Yeah. Have you experienced at all the challenge of either grants or temporarily restricted gifts that allow for the startup of a position, and then the kind of, oh, what do we do now that those funds are? To me, it's almost like, is this sort of a workplace justice issue where, we're hiring these people with these initial funds, knowing that we can keep them on for a year or so, and then for whatever reason the grant isn't there anymore, or the funder isn't going to give you any more money, and then you got a person that, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but you're stuck with that position, but maybe you need that position. Maybe it has to start at the beginning. Why did you begin the position in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about restricted grants and issues like that all day, literally all day. But yeah, I mean, I've definitely been in positions like that. I know at Patapsco, which I didn't even mention, but it was my kind of in between Laurel and Maryland Humanities. I was the executive director of an organization that ran a heritage area in Maryland.
Okay.
But we had a mission that was related to the environment and recreation as well as history, which was a lot of fun. I really liked it. And we had staffing issues that it was like, we have this staff person, they were originally all environment, but now we're going to share them with the history side of our work. And how do we break down their pay so that, 70% is going to this environmental grant and 20% is going to this history grant and 10% is coming from somewhere else. And I mean, the amount of time that goes into thinking through that, the amount of time that goes into planning how their weeks from, month to month, quarter to quarter work because of your grant income, it's really problematic. I mean, it's problematic in ways that are not only unfair to the organization, but are unfair to the staff person. And
Mhm.
so I have lots of thoughts about restricted grants.
Yeah, Mike Connolly, you know Mike, I think. We got into um, the management of those things, and the juggling act of just trying to manage the grind of sort of that business aspect of the organization, when really the mission and vision work that you're trying to do, you want that to be front and center, and the outreach work and all of that. And sometimes it's just, you at least I felt like you just get pulled right back into just the business grind of things. And I know some organizations try to create sort of business manager positions to help alleviate that load off of the executive directors. Do you guys have a position like that at or Maryland Humanities?
Well, we had a fiscal officer. We are in between. And so they would handle a lot of the finances. They would handle literally all of the finances for the organization. So I have been doing a lot of heavy lifting for that. And I've learned more about the finances than I ever would have in my first 6 months if we had somebody in that position. In terms of like, I don't think we have any staff right now that are split between grants in a way that makes us code and track in the way that it did at Patapsco. But if we did, it would fall under the financial position.
Can you tell folks a little bit more about Patapsco and the work you were doing there? There's a little sidebar.
Sure. Yeah, we had. Well, we ran a heritage area, and I know Pennsylvania has heritage areas, and there's a national heritage area program, but we were the Maryland state program, Maryland Heritage Areas Authority. And so each heritage area is a certified, individually run area, geographic area within the state of Maryland that is eligible for separate funding. It's a separate funding source. And so our area was in Baltimore and Howard counties in Maryland. Most people have heard of Ellicott City. And so Ellicott City, Catonsville were all in our area. And it was interesting. I mean, there was the heritage area side of things, which is that was my playground. That's what I understood, working with local organizations to provide professional development to museums, parks, libraries, working with them to create programming that was thematic. We did that about once a year, where we came up with this idea of Patapsco Days, and it was trying to get all of our partners to just, the deal, right? Is get all your partners to do one theme. And so we would pick a theme. The first theme we did was activism in the 20th century, and try to get all of our partners to plan a program for the month. And then we also had a mini grant program that we gave money out. And then we helped our partners write grants for the state funding. So that was up to $50,000 for non-capital and $100,000 for capital grants. And so we would help, essentially we're coaching them, and then we do an individual ranking, and then there's a state ranking, and on and on. But the environmental side of things was like stuff I had done personally in my personal volunteer time, but I had not done professionally. So stream cleanups, tree plantings, just actually getting out. And then the recreation side was we helped with trails. We helped, provide money for signage for trails. We worked closely with the Patapsco Valley State Park, which is, I think, the most visited state park in Maryland. So, I mean, it was really interesting. And I was able to grow my understanding of nonprofit work beyond the history side of things. I found out that, like, how when you're in a small museum, literally any change that you make, there's somebody who's going to get upset about it, right? Yeah. Like, we know that there's always going to be someone that's upset. It's the same for the environment. Like, we created one of our things that was grant funded that we did not actually have as a part of our mission, but it was grant funded, was to do a whole pet waste campaign about basically picking up dog poop. I mean, that was literally what it was. And my environmental person ran it. People got really angry about this campaign in a way that I was like, this is like museum work. I would never, why would someone get mad about this? I mean, people were mad. I still get calls on my phone because somehow my number is linked in some way, and people want to yell at me about pet waste. And I'm like, no longer my problem. Let me give you the staff's number, who I love my staff there, but I happily give their number for the pet waste complaints that I receive.
I have this sort of tongue-in-cheek thing that I say sometimes, that executive directors do three things: say thank you, apologize, and ask for money.
Pretty much. Yep. And that's pretty much it.
If you tease it out, it comes down to, like, if you're doing your job pretty well, you should be thanking people more than apologizing. And asking for money is more of a sort of a blunt way of saying cultivating the relationships and and gifts and all those things, advancement. And so does Maryland Humanities have a do they have like a an endowment?
I don't think it's an endowment per se,
Okay.
but we do have savings. We have a target goal in terms of savings that was established before I came, and we are over that amount currently.
Yeah.
We've talked a bit about should we reevaluate in the age of COVID. If I think it's 6 months operating was what they had set, and so that's been a conversation. But we're also, not everyone knows that the humanities councils around the country, there's 56 state and territorial humanities councils, are receiving a significant amount of general operating support from NEH. And so with that, I mean, in some ways you're at risk with any general operating support that you come to depend on, right? So Trump cut NEH like completely, like he wanted it to disappear for 4 years. But those years, NEH actually experienced growth in terms of what was actually funded. But I think that combined with COVID, you end up again, like almost similar to 2008 of like, well, we don't know what's going to come next. You know, we were on the chopping block for 4 years. Who's to say we won't be back there? I think we're pretty confident that during the Biden administration, we will not end up in the same place. But there's really strong bipartisan support for NEH funding. And NEH works through their Fed-state partnership to fund the different humanities councils. Now we've diversified, right? Because we don't want to be all NEH funding, but it's still a major part of each year's budget.
Can you give the 30-second version for anyone viewing that's not familiar with kind of the structure of how state humanities, can you give us like the layman version of, okay, there's the federal and then these councils. Can you give that structure real quick for us?
Sure. So NEH is a federal agency, and similar to what I said about the heritage areas, each council, each of the 56 is run within their state. Some have really strong partnerships with universities, some have strong relationships with their actual state structure. We're a 501c3.
Okay.
And so there's a funding formula that determines, for example, they're asking for 70 million to go to the Fed state partnership, I think in fiscal year 22. Of that 70 million, there is actual a math equation that determines how much each council will receive. And so we receive that funding, and it's general operating support. People use it for grant money in their state. We personally have a funding stream from Maryland, from the state of Maryland, that we have been able to secure. We use that for our grants because it's more flexible. But we're all just doing our own thing, doing the best that we can, right, in our individual states, but we have strong federal support through that relationship.
So these were set up years back of community leaders and activists that wanted the humanities to be a central part of their state. Is that the history, and so that they were set up? Or
yes, I mean, Jason, you're like quizzing me on what I heard my director of advancement say like 20 times. We just had our advocacy, and I'm like, when he said it, I was always thinking, okay, what am I saying next to these legislative staff? But yes, it was a federal thing, and then it became, okay, we need this in each state, because the ability of the federal government to have that many programs, to be able to administer grants in the same way is you would have a lot of places that weren't accessible. So the state humanities councils are really meant to have that wider reach in their individual communities.
I'm familiar with some of the work that Pennsylvania's been doing, and work that I did with the Historical Society, but tell us some highlights about what some of the things that Maryland Humanities is excited about now.
Sure. So everybody knows, right, about museums on Main Street. I think a lot of small museum people know that. So we run the Museums on Main Street program, which is where a Smithsonian exhibit is brought into a community. The organization that's hosting it creates a companion exhibit, and then the really long-lasting impact is the partnerships that are built around that. So there's a lot of programming and partnership building. So we run the Maryland's Museum on Main Street program. We run One Maryland, One Book. It's exactly what it sounds like, a statewide reading program. Just announced our next pick for the fall, The Book of Delights by Ross Gay. I have it here, have not read it yet. I hear it's wonderful. We run a grant program, as you're aware, as I've mentioned, and I am blanking on one. Oh, History Day. We all know History Day, right?
Okay.
So I think small museum people are generally aware of History Day. We run the statewide the statewide contest, and we work with the individual counties and on their county contests as well.
It's interesting. In Pennsylvania, History Day is lodged. I guess it depends on the state. Sometimes it's lodged at a university. In Pennsylvania, it's with a historical organization. So
yeah, it's very state by state. So we run One Maryland, One Book. We're also the Maryland Center for the Book. That's not always with humanities councils.
okay.
I think that Maryland has been successful, and so they've been able to add on different things, but it is not unheard of for History Day to live within the humanities. It's just not every state is doing that in that way.
How does your if I'm a small to mid-sized museum in Maryland, and I have a I don't know, a project, an initiative, an exhibit, there's an application process that maybe I can secure a little bit of funds from Maryland Humanities. Is there been a shift over the years on how you guys are giving those funds out and how intentional you are, the kinds of things you want to see, the follow-up, community engagement? I mean, back in the day, it was sort of like, get a grant for an exhibit, and at least I remember it could just be just the exhibit, and there wasn't much about community engagement or the follow-up. Do you speak about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I think a few years ago, we brought on Marilyn. Her last name is Hatza now, and she became the outreach and community engagement, I might be messing up her title, as well as grants program officer. And so I think there's a deeper tie into creating relationships with grassroots organizations, not just museums.
Okay.
And then having like an ongoing relationship with them. Currently, our grant program is large, up to 10,000, and mini, up to 1,200. We anticipate being able to announce a major change to that, which I think will be more aligned with the field and where the field is going, and maybe my personal beliefs about restricted grants. So I can't really say that, but maybe by the time this podcast comes out, you can link to, maybe you can link to some major news that we've announced. But I think being aware of the fact that providing a grant for one exhibit is really in some ways problematic and doesn't have the deeper impact and the support that we would like to show to organizations in the state has been a driving force in rethinking how we do our grant program. We were able to, and I don't know when this podcast will come out, right? But we were able to provide over $500,000 in CARES Act funding throughout the state of Maryland. We provided 100 organizations with a budget of $300,000 or less, with a little over $5,000 in operating support. And the staff got that out in May before I arrived. And we anticipate finding out that the American Recovery Act will pass soon. It's back in the House today, I think. And in that is $135 million for NEH. And that should come to us as another round of funding. We don't know the details on it, but we believe it will be up to 80% more. So we're thinking a little shy of $1 million in funding that we'll be able to get back out the door once we know what the parameters are from NEH. And that will probably also be general operating support for smaller organizations around the state. We may change the formula a little bit, but I am always going to be an advocate for small museums. That's where my history is, right? That's where I know that so many of them are struggling, especially right now when they can't have their gala and they can't have their silent auction or their 5K or whatever they do every year. So any ways that we can help them, because my vision for Maryland Humanities is less about Maryland Humanities as an organization and more about Maryland Humanities little h and how we lift up the field and strengthen the wider humanities network beyond just museums to include libraries, universities, schools, and not only lift them up, but connect them. So those are kind of my two big visions for Maryland Humanities in the coming years, which is my answer to your question about grants.
Yeah, there's there's that connection piece is so important, and you find where people are kind of working in their foxhole or their bubble, and you can understand where they're coming from because they're just getting slammed in all directions and they're trying to keep their heads above water. But it's if they can come up for a little bit of air, those connections are really key. Do you have a strategic planning process that's helping you with that vision, or how are you approaching
So,
that?
yeah, I will say two things. One is that our strategic plan is basically ended when I started. And so right before I hopped on this call, I was trying to create a framework to evaluate the proposals we've just received to start the new process. The other thing is that they started in the last strategic plan with the idea that they should have regional offices around the state. And that evolved into Marilyn, our community engagement and grants person, working on these things called regional humanities networks. And I said from the start, because I learned about them last year at SMA and, before everything shut down. And I saw a sheet and I was like, it was before I was employed with Maryland Humanities, right? And I was like, I've never heard of this. I feel like I know everything about Maryland Humanities. How have I never heard of it? And so becoming the ED, I was like, I think this is one of the most important things that we can do for the field of humanities in Maryland. And so I really want to see us grow it. And the regional humanities networks are simply just an opportunity to get museum folks, library folks, university folks, schools, teachers in the same room and talking. So it's not a mandated, this is what we're focused on accomplishing out of these meetings. It is our greatest accomplishment will it be that you all talk to each other when we're not in the room. Because and I know museum people do not know how to get a hold of school teachers, right? They don't know how to get a hold of library people. Like we might have one or two that we know and we have worked with in the past, but that greater networking opportunity, that ability to talk to each other and plan and work on community issues, it's not there because we are in our, as you said, foxholes. Like we are just trying to get through the day and get done. So I see that as one of the most important initiatives that we're going to, expand and grow in the next few years at Maryland Humanities.
Yeah, I mean, the successes you hear about in arts and culture are, the local library partners with the I mean, that's where you hear the successes, and that's pretty neat. Do you have any stories or thoughts? Could be in your current role or just in your career that you could share, maybe even with emerging professionals, in terms of professional development, job finding the roles that will help advance your career. You've always struck me as someone that's like really like your path, what you're doing, and you like, and I've really admired that. Like you've been very intentional. Maybe on the surface it comes across that way, but maybe it's just you've just rolled into one thing after the next, like me or some other people.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just doing a Zoom with my teammate from college is now the coach for Goucher, and she had us do a Zoom with some of the current players to talk about our career path. And so I was in a room with two people who had gone like this, right? Like their career path was in no way related to what they majored in. And, and I'm like, I majored in history. I became an ED of a museum. I moved on to another ED with a tangential like museum role. And now I'm ED of an organization that works with museums. So I am not like this. I am pretty straight, right? Or at least it seems like it's that way. I mean, I would say that one thing that I did not hesitate to do, and looking back, I realized I probably ruffled some feathers, but I don't really care. Is that I was really straightforward, and I tried to be intentional about what I wanted to do outside of being the executive director of Laurel, right? And so, uh, I really like doing the MAP program. You did the MAP program with AAM too, right? Yeah, the museum assessment program where you get to go like literally visit someone and tell them like this is what
Yeah.
I would do. I
Yeah.
mean, in a nice way, right? But you get to visit more places, you get to see more models and more ways in which people work. I feel like those types of opportunities to kind of look into somebody else's work for a brief second was really helpful in growing my understanding of my own work and what the options were for the future. So MAP was one of them. I served on AAM's program committee, which has its own flaws, I will say, but I still got to learn a lot about the process, but also about what other people are doing. And because you read so many proposals beyond what just shows up at AAM. And I love doing that for SMA too, right? Like reading the proposals for SMA, you get to hear all the cool stuff that people are doing. And you get to learn a lot more than you actually do when you go to the sessions because you don't, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's not true, but you get a broader overview of many different projects and many different ways in which people are addressing issues that are important to you. So I would say that I would highly recommend thinking about ways in which you can take a peek into what other professionals are doing rather than just your own track. I think that really broadened my understanding of the field, especially when you're a small museum person, I had one part-time person and I still talk to her. I still like her. We were good friends for, 10 years, good colleagues, but she wasn't a museum professional. So I highly, highly recommend reaching out to those networks so that your vision is not just what you're doing, but you can work with your colleagues and also understand everything else that might be happening in the field that people think is important enough to be put forward in some way, whether it's a session or a podcast or whatever it is.
I think what you said can be so helpful for someone interviewing, maybe their first couple interviews, trying to get a position, is that I found the strongest interviews are people that they don't talk a lot about the technical expertise they have. They talk about trends. They talk about connections. They talk about all of these, the interconnectedness of these things. And I find, at least for me, that those are really strong interviews because if you're at the table, they already know that you have the technical expertise. I mean, you're not there to interview about your knowledge about how um, to write a grant per se, or how to manage the collections. Um, so your background allowed you to just bring in all of that information, I'm sure, in interviews too, and be able to see all those different connections, which is, I mean, that's really, really good stuff.
So the application process to Maryland Humanities was very rigorous. I will say that. When I was I think I started up again a month, or no, I'm sorry, less than a week after I had my second baby. So it was an interesting time, right? Like May 2020. But as a part of that process, they did very detailed, long phone calls with my references. And one of my references was the chair of the board for part of the time that I was at Maryland Humanities, who I worked with closely. Um, and I remember she told me some of the conversation, and she said, I told them, like, you may not know everything, but you always know who to ask. and you never hesitate to ask. And that is so, when she said it, I was like, wait, doesn't everybody do that? Like, of
Yeah.
course you don't know everything. Like, of course you have to send an email to 15 of your closest small museum colleagues to ask them, what do you do for your, key policy? Like, why would I know that? You just tell me what you do and I'll adjust, based on best practices. But it was just really telling to me to hear her say that, because I just thought, well, isn't that what everyone does? And I've been thinking about that a lot since. Is I am definitely the person that will reach out and ask. And even more so, I am the person that if you reach out and ask, I will tell you if I have any resources that can help you, or I will try to connect you with someone who I know is better than I am at that topic.
Yeah. Well, Lindsay, Maryland Humanities is they're really lucky to have you, and I appreciate your time. And with that, we're gonna wrap up with the lightning round.
Oh, yes.
So these are tough. These are tough questions. You have to choose.
I'm ready.
Let's see. Soccer or roller derby?
Have you met me? Soccer.
Okay. Or you prefer saying football?
I say soccer. My husband tries to correct me. I say soccer. I grew up with Mia Hamm. It's soccer.
All right. In the morning, you have your choice: pancakes or waffles.
A bagel? I don't know.
Bagel? Neither, huh?
Yeah. I don't like to listen to rules, Jason. I'm sorry.
Okay. And if you could, I know you speak Spanish, correct?
I mean, speak would be a very generous estimate of what I do.
Well,
But yes, I try.
other than Spanish, if you could learn, you have to choose this. Would you like to learn Arabic or Japanese?
Arabic. I know some Arabic. So Arabic.
Nice. That's cool. Both of them are pretty tough, I think.
Yeah, I don't know any Japanese, so I'd be starting at zero. Arabic, I can say a few things, so I would go there for sure.
Cool. Well, what is it? Shukran for thank you.
Yeah. And masalama.
Nice, nice. Well, I appreciate your time, and I will shoot you an email when this comes out. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, we have quite a few interviews banked that I'm still processing, but I'll let you know when it airs.
Perfect. This was great. Thank you so much, Jason. I'm glad you're doing this. I can't wait to see all the episodes.
All right, Lindsay, thanks again.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.